Hello everybody. In this video, I will be covering some of the kind of core concepts, themes, and background for some of the philosophical readings for this week. This video covers everything except the New Testament and Quran, and we'll be doing a little bit different work with that at a slightly later date. So let's go ahead and get started. You may want some note-taking materials, you may want your textbook, and we'll go ahead and move on. So, first up, Plato and Aristotle. These are considered some pretty foundational thinkers in ways that have had really broad global influences beyond their own cultures. Plato and Aristotle both lived relatively kind of within the same time. Their lives had some overlap, but they are considered absolutely the foundational kind of Greco-Roman thinkers. They're both Greek. Now, Plato was the student of Socrates. Aristotle came a little bit later and was the teacher of Alexander the Great, in addition to just being sort of a general teacher, philosopher type. So their work actually spread after their deaths through the Arabic world, down into North Africa, kind of wherever eventually that the Roman Empire's spread was. Their works reached at least that far, if not farther. And so then because of that, they have continued to have kind of pretty wide reach and become pretty foundational to other forms of philosophy, other trends in philosophy. The way that they were transmitted has taken many different forms over the centuries. What is especially notable is that they were extremely popular in the classical era, during classical Greek era and during the Roman Republic and Empire. But then when the Western Roman Empire kind of started to collapse, their work had already been transmitted to the Arabic world via the Eastern Roman Empire. And so during the early medieval period, most Western Europeans didn't really know who Plato and Aristotle were, especially Aristotle. And it wasn't until the kind of early high Middle Ages that Aristotle was able to be transmitted back to Western Europe via the Islamic world. Now, what's really fascinating is that Aristotle ended up becoming really key to a number of medieval Christian theologians, and sort of because of that transmission, even modern Christianity does take certain forms of learning and thought from Aristotle. Additionally, if you have ever had any kind of high school or college rhetoric class, philosophy class, public speaking class, you also may recognize Aristotle as the father of rhetoric. All that ethos, logos, pathos, advertising, political argumentation stuff. So let's take a look at each of these individually, and just for reference, this guy's Aristotle, very friendly looking. This guy's Plato, he kind of looks like my ex-boyfriend. Now Plato, not to be confused with my ex-boyfriend, is sort of the earlier of the two thinkers, and his piece, as you may have noticed, has a very dialogic and narrative style. In fact, he uses a similar kind of structure to Ovid, where he sort of constructs a fictional version of himself that he then inserts into his text as a witness, not to his own teachings, but to the teachings of his sort of mentor, Socrates. So a great deal of Plato's writing is actually what he claims to be sort of just the transmission of Socrates' ideas. So because he didn't have like a tape recorder and he wasn't like recording Socrates while he taught, we don't necessarily know to what extent Plato is being truthful. We do know that Socrates was a very popular, mostly popular, Athenian philosopher. We know that he had great effect on sort of the philosophical ideas of the city-state. We know that he was ultimately considered dangerous by the city's leaders, the whole hemlock thing. But in Plato's dialogues, we don't necessarily know how much of the Socrates character is telling the reader or telling the other characters what Socrates believed, or if this Socrates character is telling us what Plato believes. So Plato is doing this really interesting kind of narrative interference in the way that Ovid creates a narrator version of Ovid as well. This has a couple of effects. Number one, it creates an authorial distance. We maintain a little bit of a distance from kind of Plato, the real person, because he has kind of given us a couple layers of narrators that we have to get through first. We have to get through sort of this fictionalized Socrates first, then we have to get through this Plato narrator before we can get to Plato the author. On the other hand, what this kind of does for us is it really gives us the chance to look at this text as an interesting literary piece in addition to being full of some really foundational philosophical ideas. So one of the hearts of Plato's philosophy, and you will probably already be familiar with this, is the concept of forms and the allegory of the cave. And this just essentially says that for every kind of thing that we observe in life, it's a mere copy, it's a mere shadow of what he calls the form, wherein the true version of something is kind of like the original, the form of the thing, and everything that we see is sort of a cheap copy of this ultimate form. So every cup that you hold is sort of a shadow cup that is just a cheap copy of the formal idea of a cup, the formal concept. Think of it almost as being like when you're 3D printing something. You can 3D print a cup, but it's not really a cup, it's a 3D print of one. And I don't explain this very well, obviously, because I am not a philosopher. I am a literature teacher. So really, again, what I find so fascinating about this is sort of the narrative structure, the narrative style. Obviously, he leans very heavily on dialogue, and he's trying to create something of a distance between himself and his characters and his ideas and his audience. Now, let us contrast this to what Aristotle does. Aristotle lived a little bit later, 385 to 322. Once his works were reintroduced to Western Europe and especially to Catholicism in kind of the high medieval period, so 1100s, 1200s, kind of around the time of the earlier Crusades, he became extremely popular. A lot of medieval theologians jumped on his work, loved it. It was adapted very quickly for Christian canon. And because of that, a lot of later thinkers have very Aristotelian ideas as well, and that even lingers today in a number of ways. For example, in my own kind of college introductory religion course, we did read some Aristotle because of his very foundational place in sort of Christian religious thought. So where Plato creates kind of this narrative distance by having these layers of narrator and of characters, Aristotle collapses this narrative distance, and his piece feels sort of more like a lecture. You feel like he's kind of lecturing directly to you, rather than that there is some philosopher lecturing to someone else that we're just overhearing and happening to learn from. We feel as if he is speaking directly to us. Now, beyond just this, Aristotle also uses the first person pronoun. He says I, and this is not something that we encounter a whole lot of in texts of this era. In a story, you'll have characters talk about themselves sometimes. You know, you see this in the Iliad, you see this in the Metamorphoses, sometimes characters will refer to themselves, but Aristotle isn't doing that. He's not even creating sort of a fake Aristotle to narrate for us. He is just coming to his writing as himself in a way that feels very authentic and in a way that feels much more modern than some of these other more distanced moves. And as we'll see, this trend to distance oneself from the content of one's writing is something that will continue on and off throughout the medieval period. But for Aristotle, he very much kind of collapses this distance and wants you to know that he's talking to you. He's talking directly to you, the reader. And this ends up being more akin to Augustine's work that we'll get to in the next video. So then finally, Confucianism is a little bit older than both Plato and Aristotle. Confucius lived around 551 to 479 BC, so he's a little bit older than the other two, but not by a whole lot, which kind of in the grand scheme of history really does sort of make them um, temporal peers, which is wonderful because they are both so foundational to their own sort of philosophical systems. Um, Much like Plato and Aristotle, Confucius was not a what we would sort of think of as a religious leader. He's not sort of doing the work of the Bible or the Quran. He is arguing for a more secular morality. And his piece is a little bit more like Plato's in some ways. It is quite dialogic, and it also creates a bit of distance where the Analects themselves, which is sort of the piece where he gives the piece of writing where he gives all of his kind of most famous pieces of wisdom and pieces of advice, is quite dialogic. And instead of saying, here's what I think, here's what I believe, the structure is very sort of, the master says this, the master says that. In some translations, it will say Confucius instead of the master, but that would be very much along the lines of saying, the teacher said this, the teacher said that. So it does have a very rigid sort of textual structure because the Analects are literally just the master says this, the master says that. Here is what the master says about different topics. And this rigid structure really maps very well onto his thematic concerns. He himself called himself a transmitter who invented nothing. So this is also pretty indicative of some of these other ancient thinkers. Think about Socrates saying, I know nothing except that I know nothing. Or even sort of the humility of Jesus, who's saying, I'm coming to you humbly. So a lot of these ancient figures really built a sense of ethos, a sense of personal credibility by intentionally not taking credit for the things that they're saying. Which is a pretty strong move because then if you turn out to be right, then nobody thinks you're being arrogant. They're more likely to believe you. But the heart of Confucius's teachings, kind of thematically, is this intense focus on self-cultivation, and self-cultivation sort of in every area of life. Essentially, for Confucius, he encourages people to become virtuous through always kind of doing this process of self-reflection, self-cultivation, becoming better, and by doing so through a foundation of knowledge, of ever-increasing knowledge. Now, his works are often split into sort of two pieces. There's a very personal piece and a very political piece, but both of them have this really highly individualistic sense of personal responsibility, whereupon it is sort of every person's responsibility to be a good person. It is every person's responsibility to develop goodness in regard to their place in society. So ethically, he also does advocate for a sense of kind of empathy and how your personal ethics should be based on empathy and truth, honesty, these kinds of things. But then politically, he believes in a very rigid social hierarchy. So just this kind of maps onto his narrative structure pretty well because his textual structure is also so rigid. And I personally find it interesting that he has sort of his writing feels so structurally rigid, but that for personal morality, he really resists this concept of rigid rule memorization over a broader sense of trying to better oneself. Again, the structure, the genre seems to more map onto the themes when he discusses sort of the way that society should be structured, which is along kind of these strictly hierarchical lines and along lines where he believes that most people are probably not capable of self-governance. He's not sure that they're intelligent enough or that they're kind of equal enough, which is something that all of these ancient philosophers kind of share some concepts that we find uncomfortable today. But the whole point is that Confucius is this really interesting blend of this very flowing kind of self-cultivation, but also a sense of this really intense rigidity. And I think that would be an interesting avenue to explore if we had more time to spend with him. But for now, that's all I have for you. Tune in next time for Augustine.